Before germ theory was fully understood, before pharmacies existed on every corner, before the word antibiotic had even been coined, frontier doctors in rural America were treating infected wounds with bread mold. Not guessing, not hoping, actually treating infections with a grayish paste scraped from moldy bread and applied directly to festering wounds. That mold was penicillin. Crude, unpure, inconsistent in strength, and still more effective than anything else those doctors had access to. This is not a story about quack medicine. This is a story about practical men who figured out something real through observation and necessity, long before a laboratory in London isolated the active compound and turned it into the most important drug of the 20th century. I am going to walk you through exactly how they did it, step by step. And I'm going to tell you what it means for you today, right now, in a world where the supply chain is not guaranteed, and knowing how things work is still the best insurance policy there is. If you find this useful, hit subscribe. And drop a comment. I read every one. Let me be absolutely clear before I go any further. I am not a medical professional. This is not medical advice. This is historical process, biology, and practical knowledge. If you have an infection, you go to a doctor. That is not negotiable. The purpose of this video is not to teach you to replace antibiotics. It is to teach you what frontier doctors actually did, why they did it, and what that tells us about how antibiotics work in principle. Understanding the principle is the point. That is what this channel is for. Now let us go back, not to some romanticized frontier past, to the real one. It was a world where a scratch from a barn door could kill you, where a tooth infection could spread to your jaw, then your blood, then your whole body, and there was nothing anyone could do except wait and hope. Where childbed fever, infections that killed new mothers within days of delivery, was so common it was simply accepted as one of the risks of having children. Where Civil War surgeons performed amputations not just because the limb was damaged, but because leaving it attached meant the patient would almost certainly die of infection within a week. The medical tools available before antibiotics were limited to cutting, cleaning, cauterizing, and praying. That was it. Germ theory itself was still being debated in the 1870s. Louis Pasteur had published his work on bacterial fermentation in the 1860s. Joseph Lister had demonstrated that carbolic acid could reduce surgical infections in the 1860s and 1870s. But in rural America, on the frontier, among homesteaders living hundreds of miles from the nearest city hospital, none of this knowledge had arrived yet. The doctors who served those communities were often trained through apprenticeship, not medical school. They learned by working alongside an established physician, often for years, learning what worked through direct experience because there was no other resource to consult. They read medical journals when they could get them. They wrote to each other. They shared what they observed. And what they observed, over and over, was that wounds covered with moldy bread sometimes healed when they should have rotted. The story of penicillin as we know it begins in 1928, when Alexander Fleming left a petri dish of Staphylococcus uncovered in his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London before going on vacation. When he returned, he found that a blue-green mold had contaminated the culture, and that everywhere around the mold, the bacteria were dead. Most people in that situation would have thrown the dish away and started over. Fleming looked at it and asked why. That question changed medicine forever. He named the substance penicillin after the penicillium mold that produced it. He published his findings. And then, for nearly 15 years, almost nothing happened with it. Fleming did not have the chemistry background to purify the compound. The pharmaceutical industry was not interested in a substance they could not synthesize, concentrate, or sell reliably. And so penicillin sat in a laboratory, known to be effective but impractical to produce in any meaningful quantity. Here's the part they do not always tell you. While Fleming's discovery sat idle in London, rural doctors across the United States were independently discovering something the pharmaceutical industry had not bothered to pursue. They had no petri dishes, they had no laboratory, they had bread, and they had wounds, and they had observation. And what they observed was consistent enough that it became part of their standard practice. When a patient came in with an infected laceration, a doctor in Kansas or Montana or rural Georgia would sometimes take a slice of bread, let it grow mold, scrape that mold into a paste, and apply it to the wound. Then they would watch. And more often than they could explain, the infection would begin to recede. The swelling would go down, the pus would clear, the patient would live. They did not know why. They knew that it worked often enough to be worth trying. That is the difference between frontier medicine and laboratory science. Laboratory science wants to know why before it acts. Frontier medicine needs to act and then figures out the why later, if ever. The mold in question was Penicillium, the same genus of fungus that penicillin comes from today. But not every Penicillium mold produces meaningful amounts of penicillin. Most strains produce little or none. The right strain, grown under the right conditions, produces the compound in quantities sufficient to inhibit bacterial growth. The frontier doctors could not test their cultures for potency. They could not measure penicillin concentration in parts per million. They could only observe whether the wound improved or did not. So they learned empirically which mold looked right, which bread worked best, which temperatures seemed to produce the strongest cultures, and which methods of application gave the most consistent results. Everything they learned was passed from doctor to doctor through medical correspondence, journals, and word of mouth. By the time Florey and Chain figured out how to mass-produce penicillin in the early 1940s, frontier doctors had already been using crude versions of the same basic idea for decades. Let me describe what the right mold looks like because this is critical. If you leave a slice of bread out in the open air, it will eventually get moldy. Most of what grows on bread is useless or actively harmful. Aspergillus niger produces the black mold you sometimes see on bread. Rhizopus stolonifer is the gray fuzzy mold sometimes called bread mold. Stemphylium and alternaria produce dark-colored patches. None of these produce penicillin in any meaningful quantity. Penicillium looks different. It starts as white, cottony, thread-like growth that spreads across the bread surface. That is the mycelium, the root structure of the fungus. Within a few days, as the mold matures and begins to produce spores, that white growth takes on a blue-green color, something like the color of blue cheese or the mold that grows on the rind of brie. The texture becomes powdery as spores are released. There is sometimes a pale yellow or greenish tinge at the margins. There is a distinctive earthy smell, not unpleasant, different from the musty odor of decomposition. That was the target. If the mold looked gray and slimy instead of blue-green and powdery, if it smelled rotten, if there was dark liquid pooling under the bread, that culture was discarded without hesitation. The identification process was visual and olfactory. These doctors were not running chemical analyses. They were using their eyes and their noses, developed through seasons of observation. They learned to recognize penicillium the way you learn to recognize a healthy tomato plant versus one that is diseased, by looking at it regularly enough that you know what right looks like. The ability to make that distinction is not complicated, but it requires attention and it requires prior knowledge. That is why I am telling you now what to look for. So if you ever need to understand the principle in an emergency, you are not starting from zero. Cultivation itself was straightforward, but it required discipline and cleanliness. The bread was the growth medium, and the choice of bread mattered. Whole wheat bread was preferred over white bread because it contained more nutrients, more protein, more natural sugars that the mold could feed on. The bread was sliced and lightly toasted on both sides to reduce the moisture content to the right range. Bread that was too wet would rot before the mold could establish itself. Bread that was too dry would not support mold growth at all. The ideal was bread that was dry on the surface, but still moist inside, like the perfect density for a sandwich. That slice was then placed on a clean plate or in a clean glass jar, covered loosely with a clean cloth or a few layers of cheesecloth to keep dust and airborne contaminants out while still allowing air to circulate. Because penicillium is an aerobic organism, it needs oxygen to grow, and set in a warm location. Temperature was kept between 70 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly room temperature in a heated building in winter. Too cold and the mold grew so slowly that competing organisms had time to take over. Too warm and the bread dried out or bacterial contamination overwhelmed the culture before penicillium could get established. The doctors who cultivated this mold successfully understood these parameters through trial and error, and they kept detailed notes because the process had to be consistent to be useful. Inoculation was the next step. A small fragment of a known healthy penicillium culture, a few millimeters across, no bigger than a pea, was placed on the surface of the prepared bread. The fragment was transferred using tweezers that had been passed through a flame to sterilize them, or a clean needle, or in some cases just a clean fingertip if nothing else was available. The fragment was pressed gently into the bread surface so it made good contact, then the cover was replaced. Within 48 to 72 hours, the mold would begin to colonize the bread. White mycelium would appear at the inoculation point and spread outward. If the culture was healthy and uncontaminated, it would transition to the characteristic blue-green color within 5 to 7 days. That was a mature, spore-producing culture ready for use or for further propagation. Culture maintenance was the most demanding part of the process, and it was where most failures happened. Any culture that showed signs of contamination, dark discoloration, slimy patches, foul odor, a general appearance of decomposition rather than healthy mold growth, was immediately discarded. The entire container was cleaned, the bread was thrown away, and a fresh culture was started. There was no saving a contaminated culture. Trying to use it would mean applying whatever bacteria had contaminated it directly to an open wound. That was worse than doing nothing. The doctors understood this instinctively. They were ruthless about discarding questionable cultures. Only cultures that looked exactly right, blue-green, powdery, no discoloration, no odor, were used, and even then the potency was unknown. They were working with faith and observation, not measurement. To keep a culture going over time, doctors practiced serial transfer. A small fragment of an active, healthy Penicillium culture was transferred to a fresh slice of prepared bread every 3 to 4 days. This kept the mold in an actively growing state and prevented it from senescing or becoming contaminated. The process was repeated indefinitely, essentially creating a mold colony that could be maintained indefinitely as long as it was fed fresh bread and kept at the right temperature. This is the same principle used in modern microbiology laboratories for maintaining bacterial and fungal strains, the periodic transfer to fresh media to keep the culture viable. The frontier doctors were doing the same thing with the tools they had, in kitchens and back rooms, with no laboratory equipment. The mortality rate before antibiotics was brutal. A Civil War arm amputation ran about 25% death from infection alone. Abdominal surgery was frequently fatal. Tooth infections killed otherwise healthy adults within 2 weeks. Childbed fever killed 1 in 10 new mothers in some hospitals in the 1840s. When Ignaz Semmelweis ordered his colleagues to wash their hands before examining patients, his maternity ward death rate dropped by 90% within a year. That was in Vienna, in 1847, at one of the world's most advanced hospitals. The knowledge took decades to reach rural America. On the frontier in the 1870s and 1880s, most doctors never heard of it. The gap between what medicine knew and what it practiced on the frontier was enormous. That gap is why bread mold persisted as a treatment for so long. When nothing else worked and you were watching a patient die by inches, you tried what others had tried before you. The training of frontier doctors varied enormously. Some had attended medical school in Philadelphia or New York. Others had no formal training beyond an apprenticeship that lasted 2 years or 10. There were no licensing requirements in most frontier states until the early 20th century. There were charlatans who sold useless tonics, but there were also genuinely skilled doctors who learned through brutal practical experience and passed what they learned through letters and medical journals. A doctor in Nebraska would write to a colleague in Colorado describing his results with bread mold. That colleague would try it and write back. Over decades, a body of practical knowledge accumulated that was never formally published in textbooks, but existed in the shared memory of doctors serving populations nobody else would serve. There is one more thing I need to say about safety. The risks of attempting frontier-style wound treatment at home are not theoretical. First, bacterial contamination in the culture is high, even under the best conditions. Applying a contaminated mold paste to an open wound means directly inoculating it with whatever bacteria happen to grow in that culture, potentially Clostridium species causing tetanus and gas gangrene, or Staphylococcus causing severe cellulitis or sepsis. Second, even a genuinely uncontaminated Penicillium culture carries allergy risk. Penicillin allergy can be severe and cannot be tested with a homegrown culture. Third, penicillin concentration in bread mold culture is completely unknown. It could be dangerously high or effectively zero. A subtherapeutic dose exposes bacteria to sublethal penicillin, which directly drives resistance development. Fourth, an infection that appears localized may already be systemic. Fever, chills, rapid heartbeat, confusion, or spreading red streaks from the wound signal bloodstream invasion. A topical mold paste cannot treat systemic infection. Nothing you can make at home can treat it. This is a medical emergency requiring hospital care. Fifth, any delay in seeking proper treatment while relying on a home remedy can turn a treatable infection into a fatal one. The window can be as short as 48 hours. I am not being cautious for caution's sake. There are failure modes in this process that can kill you faster than you expect. Now let me talk about what this means for you right now. I am not telling you to grow your own mold and treat your own infections. If you have an infected wound, you go to a clinic. You get a prescription. You complete the full course. That is the standard of care we are fortunate to have access to, and it is vastly superior to anything frontier doctors could offer. But understanding how penicillin works, where it comes from, and what frontier doctors actually did with it tells you several things that are worth knowing. First, antibiotics are not magic. They are biochemistry. Molecules produced by living organisms that have specific effects on other organisms. They can be degraded, they can be resisted, they can become ineffective if misused. Understanding this is the foundation of using them responsibly. Do not demand antibiotics for viral infections. Do not hoard them. Do not stop a course early because you feel better. Every premature cessation is a small experiment in breeding antibiotic-resistant bacteria. MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, is a direct product of that selection pressure. The more you understand how antibiotics work, the less likely you are to contribute to the problem. Second, Pharmaceutical companies did not invent medicine. They industrialized it. They took what molds were doing naturally and figured out how to extract, purify, and concentrate it into a reliable product. That is a legitimate contribution. But it also meant the underlying knowledge became proprietary. The skills frontier doctors used became obscure, not because they were ineffective, but because there was no money in teaching people to make their own medicine when you could sell them a manufactured version. The industrial food system works the same way. It is cheaper to sell you garlic powder than to teach you to grow your own. It is more profitable to sell you antibiotics than to preserve the knowledge of how mold-based treatment worked before purification was possible. Third, and this is where preparedness comes in, knowing how things work gives you options. In a genuine emergency where modern medical care is simply not available, understanding the principle behind antibiotics means you are not starting from zero. You know that Penicillin mold inhibits bacterial growth. You know how to identify it. You know it must be applied to a clean wound and changed daily. You know what contamination looks like and why you discard a contaminated culture. That knowledge is not the same as having amoxicillin in your cabinet, but it is something. And in an emergency, something is often the difference between surviving and not. There are modern parallels worth mentioning. Some amateur biologists attempt to grow penicillium strains and extract penicillin at home. I want to be direct about this. Do not do that. The extraction chemistry is beyond what is practical at home, and contamination or dosing errors are severe. Understanding why it is hard to do safely tells you more about what pharmaceutical penicillin actually is. Antibiotic resistance is one of the most serious public health threats we face, and it is accelerating. Overprescription, antibiotic use in livestock feed, and patients failing to complete prescribed courses have all contributed to bacteria our existing drugs cannot control. In a grid-down scenario, this problem becomes dramatically worse. Let me bring this back to the farm and to the kitchen, because that is where I live. Nana Ruth had a saying for everything. She used to say that the man who taught himself to do one thing well had learned how to learn, and that was the part nobody could take from you. She was right. The skills I learned on this farm, butchering, canning, curing, fermenting, preserving, are all built on the same foundation. You watch, you try, you fail, you adjust, you try again. You build a mental model of how something works based on observation, and that model lets you adapt when conditions change. The frontier doctors did exactly the same thing. They did not have a microbiology textbook. They had a wound and a piece of moldy bread and a patient who was getting worse. They tried the bread mold. The patient got better. They tried it again. The patient got better again. Over time, through trial and observation, they built a reliable enough practice out of something they could not explain. That is how all pre-industrial knowledge worked. Old techniques persist because they were tested by life and death, not by committee. I have been making things from scratch my entire life because that is what this family does. We make things, we fix things, we preserve things. We do not assume that because something comes from a factory, it is automatically better than what we can make ourselves. The industrial food system has sold us a bill of goods on convenience items that cost 10 times what the raw ingredients cost. The pharmaceutical system has sold us a bill of goods on the idea that medicine is something you buy rather than something you understand. I am not against medicine. I am for understanding how things work so that when the system fails you, eventually it will fail someone, you are not completely helpless. If you found this useful, hit subscribe. And if you know someone interested in self-reliance and understanding the history behind the products they buy, send this video to them. Every subscriber helps this channel keep going and reach more people who remember that knowing how to do things yourself is not a niche hobby. It is independence. In a world where supply chains are more fragile than most people want to admit, independence is worth more than a lot of things you can buy. I will see you in the next one.